Have you ever found yourself watching a big Hollywood blockbuster and feeling a distinct sense of deja vu? Mm-hmm. Like you've seen this story, these characters, maybe these explosions a dozen times before.
Yeah.
Or maybe you've noticed that the summer box office, despite all the hype, often feels a little, flat.
Right. Hi. Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling a fascinating and frankly quite provocative perspective on what's happening in Hollywood. The core question isn't just about, say, individual creative missteps, but whether the very structure of multi-billion-dollar corporations is inherently driving a decline in cinematic creativity and overall quality.
It's a big question. It is. Our journey into this topic takes us through a YouTube video transcript from the channel Disparu, aptly titled Hollywood, the End of an Empire. Our mission today is to kind of dissect the video's central arguments for why the entertainment industry might be experiencing what it calls a prolonged state of crisis, and also to unearth the underlying corporate incentives that are truly shaping the films, and perhaps more importantly, maybe the ones we don't.
And what's interesting here is how this source really challenges our conventional understanding.
How so?
Well, it moves beyond just critiquing, individual bad movies or maybe poor decisions by a few execs. Instead, it asks if the system itself, once it scales to a certain immense size, compels a corporate culture to evolve in ways that are ultimately kind of self-destructive, which raises a critical question. Can an industry genuinely thrive and innovate when its internal mechanisms seem to be working against its stated purpose of creating compelling original entertainment?
Right.
The video suggests that the very act of growing so huge might sow the seeds of its own undoing.
Okay, let's unpack this then, starting with the box office itself. The source immediately zeroes in on recent summer box office performance, describing them not as growing or even, significantly losing, but simply flat. Just flat.
Stagnant.
Which leads to one of its most potent claims that multi-billion-dollar corporations are where IPs go to die.
Wow, strong words.
Very strong. It points directly to Disney's acquisition of beloved franchises like Star Wars and Marvel, contending that under the wing of such a massive conglomerate, these once thriving intellectual properties have been, in the source's words, destroyed. What's the fundamental tension here that the source is getting at?
Well, the source is highlighting this profound initial tension. On one hand, these IPs are obviously immensely valuable assets, right?
Sure. Established fan bases, lore.
Exactly. Proven commercial success. They're acquired because they're seen as safe bet. Yet the video argues that once these IPs get subsumed by a vast, publicly traded conglomerate, the very act of acquisition and integration into that large structure, can lead to their erosion. The original vision, maybe the creative freedom, the sort of organic development that made them successful, that can get diluted or just lost under the new pressures of this massive corporate machine.
Oh, okay.
So the core insight here is that corporate structures, the ones optimized for efficiency and shareholder value, they might be inherently incompatible with the more unpredictable kind of iterative nature of genuine creative development, turning a valuable asset into potentially a liability for long-term innovation.
That's a powerful idea, but the source quickly complicates this picture. It argues that a modern corporation isn't just a singular, money-hungry machine pursuing pure profit.
Right. It's not monolithic.
Instead, it's depicted as this complex ecosystem of individuals, each bringing their individual biases, ideological leanings, and things they want to achieve. This, the source contends, leads to pursuing weird ideas that have nothing to do with profitability.
Like what?
Well, the examples it cites include a desire to lead the world sustainable filmmaking, which, counterintuitive, makes movies more expensive, or adopting what it calls anti-profit hiring practice. So how does the source connect these internal dynamics to the overall quality and decision making?
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting because the source argues these internal dynamics, often detached from direct financial return, don't just exist in a vacuum. They actively contribute to what the source calls incompetence and a lower quality of your product and company decision-making overall.
Right.
It challenges that conventional wisdom that, a savvy CEO or the money men can just easily override these internal tendencies. The video even references a previous CEO, Bob Chapek, described by the source as being broken and destroyed in an apology video.
Oof.
Yeah, suggesting that even top executives can become constrained or, swayed by these pervasive internal cultures and agendas.
So the culture eats strategy, even at that level.
Kind of. The insight is that when a corporation's internal missions diverge from its external market demand, and when internal biases get sort of enshrined in practice, they can become this powerful, almost unassailable force, making genuine course correction incredibly difficult, really, regardless of who's technically in charge.
Okay, so we have these internal biases shaping things, but then the source takes aim at something even more fundamental, how numbers themselves are, like the accounting.
Ah, the numbers game.
Yeah. It describes how Disney Plus, for instance, would buy Disney movies to make them appear profitable, which the source quickly dismisses as simply moving money around inside your own company.
Essentially, no new money is actually generated, right?
Exactly. It's internal shuffling, creative accounting, perhaps.
And even more strikingly, it cites specific projected profits for film, like Sinners at $60, Superman supposedly $125, Final Destination Bloodline, $75, attributed to knowledgeable individuals.
Okay.
Yet these very figures, the source highlights, are immediately disputed by a studio insider.
Yeah.
That contradiction is pretty stark. It really is.
Yeah.
And that detail raises a really important question about transparency, doesn't it?
Definitely.
Why would a company or its affiliates report numbers that are so swiftly and directly contradicted by its own internal sources?
What's the source's take on that?
Well, the video posits a rather cynical but maybe compelling answer, that when you become a company of certain size, lying makes you money and it changes the entire incentive structure.
Wow. Lying makes you money.
That's the claim. This isn't just simple misrepresentation. It's about a fundamental shift in corporate culture, prioritizing perception over reality.
The appearance of success.
Precisely. The short-term benefit of appearing profitable, even through internal accounting tricks or maybe unsubstantiated claims, can significantly outweigh the long-term risk of an honest assessment, particularly when it comes to influencing stock prices and those all-important quarterly earnings reports.
Gotcha.
So the key insight here is how a system can actually be incentivized to, well, deceive itself, where the appearance of health becomes more valuable than actual health. It creates an environment where integrity might be sacrificed for immediate financial optics.
Which leads us directly to the films themselves, right?
Yeah.
And what the audience ultimately gets to see.
Exactly.
If perception is king, then the stock market becomes the true. The stock price, the source argues, doesn't care about a film's profitability in 2 years. It cares about the hype and the story.
Short-term focus.
This pressure leads to these headline-grabbing announcements, like Robert Downey Jr. potentially returning as Dr. Doom, designed purely to create a perceptional reality for immediate quarterly earnings.
Right. Boost the stock today.
The source claims this approach systematically burns customer goodwill for instant profits, basically treating the audience as a resource to be mined for quick financial gain rather than a community to nurture long term.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it explains why studios often shy away from those big swings or maybe prolonged losses. Things that, while risky short term, could potentially lead to massive long-term success.
Like Lucas with Star Wars.
Exactly. The source contrasts this with George Lucas, who, when Star Wars was independently owned, had the autonomy to take those kinds of risks. He could absorb potential losses because he directly bore both the profits and the losses.
Makes sense.
But for publicly traded companies, fiduciary duty to shareholders largely dictates that the stock price go up, even if it's just for a single quarter. This cultivates a culture of safe, slow, incremental improvement of 2%, 3% a quarter.
Incrementalism.
Yeah. And the core insight is that this relentless pursuit of short-term stock performance can lead to a fundamental disregard for what the customer wants at all in the moment, systematically eroding trust and loyalty.
Which are vital for any creative industry's long-term health.
Absolutely. It's a fundamental conflict, really, between the demands of public ownership and the organic, often unpredictable nature of creative enterprise.
And this drive for safety, for incremental gains, according to the source, directly results in the sequel after sequel phenomenon.
Yeah.
And that pervasive, bland sameness we sometimes feel across the cinematic landscape.
We've all felt that.
Films, the video argues, effectively become just advertisements for the next movie.
Trailers for the next installment.
Meaning characters can never grow or change in any truly meaningful way because different is wrong. Different is risky.
Too risky for the quarterly report.
And in this environment, we see young, inexperienced directors being hired, maybe because they're easier for the studios to push around, more compliant with the formula.
Well, also easier to manage.
While creative risk takers are often sidelined, fired, or, well, have their visions fundamentally altered to fit that safe mold. It sounds like a cinematic feedback.
It does. And this brings us to a crucial point. The source identifies the trap of success. The trap of success. How does that work?
It's a bit of a paradox. Where a major win, like the whole Barbenheimer phenomenon last year.
Huge success.
Right. But that success can actually make future quarters harder to beat, perversely discouraging studios from taking new risks afterwards.
Because the bar is now too high.
Exactly. The source argues that this entrenched philosophy of safety harm avoidance and incremental improvement means there's really no mechanism to correct mistakes when they inevitably happen.
So you just double down.
Or you're left trolling through your load, if I puts it, because the structure makes you not mentally capable of coming up with a new idea. The true insight here is how seemingly positive outcomes, or this consistent strategy of risk aversion, can paradoxically just reinforce stagnation. Success itself becomes a barrier to genuine innovation,
Creating a self-perpetuating cycle. Right, where a creative industry optimizes itself out of the ability to produce anything truly new. So for those of us feeling like we've seen this movie before, literally, the source gives a compelling, if maybe a little cynical, reason.
That's a wonderfully grim picture you're painting there based on the source.
Ooh, well, it's the argument presented.
Okay, moving beyond domestic markets for a second. The source also examines how Marvel's massive growth was significantly fueled by entering the Chinese market.
Yeah, that was huge for them for a while.
This, the video note, led Hollywood generally to alter their movies, favoring, big explosions and visually spectacular sequences over maybe dialogue-driven films about particularly American experience.
Things that travel well visually require less cultural translation.
But now, with international markets, and specifically the Chinese box office drying up, as says,
Which it has been, relatively speaking.
Hollywood is left with this singular focus on massive big-budget tentpoles, films optimized for a global expansion strategy that just isn't delivering the same growth anymore.
It sounds like they put all their eggs in one now kind of shrinking basket.
And what's fascinating there is the profound unintended consequence.
Go on.
The intense focus on chasing that ever-growing international box office effectively eliminated entire genres from Hollywood's output. Things like authentic Westerns, weepies, or teen movies, because these were perceived as not translating as well global.
Right, they felt too culturally specific, maybe?
Perhaps. So now, without those previously lucrative markets really fueling the same level of growth, Hollywood lacks the diversity in storytelling, and crucially, the creative infrastructure needed to pivot easily.
They lost the muscles for making other kinds of films.
You could say that. It raises a significant question. How does an industry reclaim its creative breath, its sense of identity, once it is optimized so thoroughly for such a narrow and now declining commercial path?
Yeah. The insight is that a strategy of maximizing global appeal, while it might be initially successful, can ultimately strip an industry of its unique cultural identity and its capacity for diverse, resonant storytelling, leaving it vulnerable when market conditions inevitably shift, as they always do.
The source also makes a rather pointed claim about the kind of people who thrive and indeed are actively sought out in this corporate environment.
Okay, who gets hired?
It describes them as individuals who won't rock the boat, who act as social consensus machines, and who are just great at doing what you've always.
Playing it safe, maintaining the status quo.
Exact. And the video argues this links to a pervasive desire to be politically correct, where there's a set correct thing to believe and maybe a default human with a correct set of... The implication, according to the source, is that this culture actively filters out people who think different, creating an echo chamber rather than a vibrant hub of diverse ideas.
And connecting this to the bigger picture, the source argues that this internal environment, lacking genuine ideological diversity and maybe open dissent, inevitably lacks on it. And that fundamentally prevents the necessary course correction when things inevitably go wrong.
Because no one points out the emperor has no clothes.
Potentially. It claims that a truly healthy, innovative industry requires intelligent, really creative people who are willing to go against the grain and probably offend everyone else in their relentless search for new ideas, their willingness to challenge the status quo.
The disruptors.
Right. Without those dissenting voices and innovative minds, the industry, the source contends flatly, died. And this is starkly contrasted with more agile small companies, or even individuals like Elon Musk at Twitter, who the source suggests had no one else he needed to talk and could therefore move fast and break things, embracing rapid experimentation and risk in a way larger, consensus-driven corporations often cannot.
Interesting comparison.
The insight being that intellectual homogeneity, particularly in a creative field, isn't just a missed opportunity. It's potentially an active inhibitor of growth and a pathway to stagnation.
Okay, perhaps the most striking detail the source brings to light, for me anyway, is that analysts were apparently saying almost the same things 10 years ago.
A decade ago.
Really? Yeah. It references a 2015 article with predictions already sounding the alarm about the box office picture darken, the singular focus on tentpoles, and indistinguishable strategies among. That article even warned back then that history suggests as the number of films in a given genre increases, the average film performance, even for the big ones.
Wow.
So this isn't some new crisis. It's a depthly persistent problem, seemingly unaddressed for a decade.
That really brings us to a critical and, yes, somewhat depressing question.
Which is?
If the problems were so clearly identified and even potential solutions implicitly understood a whole decade ago, why has nothing fundamentally changed?
What answer does the source give?
It argues that at this point, there's no one left in the industry who knows how to do anything but optimize what they did last year.
Just optimize last year's.
That's the contention, that the company or the industry structure has become too big of too many people, too incentivized to hold on to power for as long as possible, clinging to inflated paychecks and established positions,
Protecting their own turf.
The profound insight here is about systemic inertia. It suggests that even with clear foresight, even with historical warnings, the sheer size and the entrenched incentives within a massive corporate structure can create this unmovable force, one that prioritizes self-preservation and that incremental optimization over necessary fundamental change, essentially trapping itself in a cycle of its own making.
Inertia is a powerful thing.
It really is. So this deep dive into the Disparus videos suggests that Hollywood's current struggles aren't simply, a string of bad luck or a few poor creative choices by isolated individuals or just the natural evolution of an industry. Instead, it offers a compelling argument that these challenges are potentially an inevitable consequence of its current corporate structure.
Yeah.
The relentless pressure for incremental growth to please shareholders, the systematic focus on perception over reality, and that internal culture that actively stifles dissent and risk-taking. It all seems to converge, creating this self-perpetuating cycle of sameness that gradually erodes creativity and potentially alienates the very audiences it seeks to captivate.
So after all that, what does this all mean for you, the person listening, the person who loves movies and stories? If the current system, by its very design, as this source argues, struggles to generate truly new ideas and is inherently biased towards simply iterating on what worked last year, then what role does the audience play in demanding something profoundly different?
Good question.
Is the future of truly original, maybe risk-selling, destined to emerge from entirely outside? And ultimately, what would it realistically take for a trend break free, rediscover its capacity, big, bold, perhaps tell us a story we actually have?